At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
Welcome, everyone, to American Girls, the podcast, where we're reliving the American Girl series book by book, except here on Patreon, where we're basically reading and watching whatever we want that we think lives within the world of this show. I'm Mary.
I'm still Allison, even on Patreon.
Even on Patreon. Wow. What a dedication. What a dedication to that name. Today, Allison, we come together to talk about Lois Lowry's Number the Stars.
They're innumerable. That's part of what you learn.
This book sends me to a place every single time. I've read this book like probably 3 times in my life, and wow, it gets me every time. Lois.
What would you say is your relationship to Lois Lowry as a reader?
As a reader, I read this book when I was probably like 10 years old or something. This is the first book I ever read that was set during the Holocaust. And I remember after reading this book, surprisingly to me, I did not read anything else about the Holocaust by choice for some time, a couple of years. Then I read The Diary of Anne Frank. That really set me off. I don't know where you're at with The Diary of Anne Frank, but you know, The Diary of Anne Frank for me was like one of those foundational reads where I read it when I was about 12 years old, and to me, it's a history about what it feels like to be a teenager. And I was reading it sort of like on the cusp of becoming a teenager myself, which is in many ways like when you care most about reading things that are for teenagers. Like I remember actively reading 17 magazine when I was 12, not when I was actually 17. And that really sent me in a spiral where there was a period of time where I was reading like every Holocaust memoir, novel I could get my hands on. What about you? Did you have a similar stage?
So I have a different, I love Lois Lowry's books. The Giver is not my favorite, but it is a book that I really enjoyed. I would say for a lot of my childhood, Bridge to Terabithia was my favorite book.
Interesting.
I adore Bridge to Terabithia. I saw a production of that show. This is where I'm very grateful that there are periods of my life or our lives for our generation that are not excessively documented. I bet if I saw a picture of how that story was staged, it was staged for about $25, but it was a special show that I got to go to with my Girl Scout troop. I love the story of Bridge to Terabithia, and I actually think there's a lot of connection to this book, which I can talk about later. I really, really, really liked her writing. That book resonated with me so much because I was a kid who liked to play in the woods. And there's an element in this book as well, but I just like really dug into that. This book was something that I really enjoyed, but I had a frustrating experience reading this book. Much to our surprise, this book is only about 120 pages. I read this book in school. And that was not ideal. I read Anne Frank on my own first. I read Number the Stars. I can picture it. I can picture the cover. And we can talk about who the girl is on the cover. I could picture this clear as day. I knew I didn't own the book, so I had to buy it for this because I read it when I was in elementary school. I hated reading this book in school because it's not that long and it took forever.
Yeah, that was a frustrating experience when you had to like read at the pace of class. I just tend to hate things I had to read for school because looking back, I never liked somebody telling me what was important about a book. And like, I just wanted to decide that for myself or for me to decide like if I liked something or if I thought it was a good book. I didn't like a teacher in particular saying, and of course, this is a classic of American literature, and telling you what experience you were supposed to have, because then it kind of sets you up. It's overhyped. like, oh my God, it's part of this class. It's like one of only 4 books we're reading. This must be an amazing book. And then you read it and you're like I read Moby Dick for school and I could not have been more disappointed or like, frankly, just furious by that experience. I was like, are you kidding me? Like, enough. Like, I just in rage, like in protest, I stopped even trying in the test. Like it was not hard to do well in this class. So I just started writing. Every essay was like, now this character is a Christ figure. I went to Catholic school. So it was like, that was my protest. But I totally hear you. And I'm also a big time Catherine Patterson stan. But I will say that Jacob Have I Loved is her best book. And I'm not taking questions on that. Like, have you read Jacob Have I Loved?
I have. It is probably my least favorite of her books.
Excuse me? Okay, we've never discussed this, and now I feel like I have to stop recording because this is at my ground zero. Like, before my like teen years, reading A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, reading Little Women, and reading Jacob Have I Loved with my mom was like these were foundational reading experiences in my life. And I remember reading Baby, which is another Catherine Patterson book, with my mom, and my mom was like sobbing when we finished the book.
There are many books by her that I absolutely adore, and those are not any of them. And I am willing to give a reread. I did not like A Tree Grows in Brooklyn when I read it. I know that's a very unpopular, and please feel free to dissent or turn this off. Please don't withdraw your support. I am willing to reread it. I don't care for it in terms of my memories. I know I feel like that's a bad...
I mean, I know this is an audio medium, so the listeners can't see how wide my eyes are, the look of genuine shock on my face. Like, I don't know what to say. Like, you didn't connect with Francie Nolan, like, at all. Like...
No,
the sibling story and Jacob Have I Loved. Like, I grew up with siblings who were very close in age to me. Like, my brother and I were raised as twins. He's 11 months older. So that book like hit me where I lived, where I was like, oh my God, what am I supposed to do with this person who I'm like going through life with? We're so different. We drive each other insane, but we love each other. Like, it's complicated. Like, that book was so foundational to me, like figuring out how to like coexist with my brother in school. Like, we were in the same class, all of this stuff. Wow, Allison, this is like, we're starting off on like, you've very much unsettled me. Like, I almost need to pause, like call my mom, talk to someone who like understands Catherine Patterson. Like,
I'm a big fan of many of her other books. I also know from people who do work with her, because she's still a very prominent labor historian. You know, she works with labor historians on a lot of things. She's lovely.
Okay,
so
wow, love to hear that.
Only heard great things about her. This was not the book that I would say ignited or kind of got an interest going for me in World War II. This was not particularly a book that I even really connected with that, which I think probably sounds kind of strange. This to me was a very powerful story about courage and girlhood, right? Like, after reading other books that were about sort of like men serving or you know, other books that we've read kind of in the Anne Rinaldi universe of soldiers, like this book really connected with me about what it meant to be brave. But I have a pretty vivid memory of basically just reading far ahead and then having no idea what we were supposed to talk about, because it's a pretty climactic book about, you know, a family that's in peril, and a family that really, we would think of them as people who choose to not just be bystanders, people who choose to resist a system and to actually be part of saving people's lives in a humanitarian crisis. That, I don't think, was what resonated with me so much as like the intimacy of the characters and their lives and things that were important to them. I think I read other books that were more kind of in line with that, but this was not one of them.
Yeah, I think for me, this book was really interesting in terms of like looking back. I don't know that I can remember what was so interesting, like what drove me to be so interested in this in the time, but I think the plot was definitely probably what drove me initially, like the suspense that takes you through this admittedly brief to us now as adults book. But I'm sure at the time it felt like a lifetime for me to finally get to the end of the book and figure out if they were going to safely escape the Nazis, help their friends escape the Nazis. But looking back now and rereading it for our conversation today, I think what really strikes me about this book is the ways that it like so perfectly encapsulates how the war and how the threat of the Nazis turned this community into a space where the line between adults and children was purposefully blurred in each direction. So something that really struck me was when this book opens, it opens with a very normal scene of like two girls who are racing down the street to prepare for like basically a foot race at school at the end of the week. And they abruptly are stopped by Nazis who are basically like, why are you running? And then was the genius of Lois Lowry to me is that when she's writing that scene, she doesn't just write it as a panicked girl who is scared, knows enough to be scared of the Nazis who have been occupying Copenhagen now for years. She writes it as someone who is a child in that moment, but also like we get into her mindset where she's coaching herself, like, don't say too much, don't speak too much. Like, don't, like, yes, be innocent like a child would be, but don't say too much, And so you can see the ways that like she's a child, but she's actually already aged beyond perhaps her years by the stress of this situation. And in the same way, like her parents and her neighbors, more specifically, her Jewish neighbors, are treated like children. And the members of the community, like there's a woman who owns a button shop where they go to buy a button to repair her younger sister's coat. And it's been shut down because now the Nazis have forbidden them to run their business. And so they get infantilized by the Nazis, these adults. So it's like that drops you into this world where it's like things that you expect about roles based on, the age of a person are completely upended.
I think something this book, so the book is set in 1943, which is also where the Molly books begin. And I think something that's really smart is there's this tension in the narrative between people almost starting to get used to certain aspects of the Nazi accommodation because it does last for quite some time. And for the protagonist, Anne Marie, being old enough to have had memories of what life was like before. And as you mentioned, Anne Marie has a younger sister who's just young enough where this has been her life. And that's talked about quite a bit in the book. But there's this central struggle between Anne Marie, who's really kind of our guide through this story, and this question of what's going to happen to her friend, Ellen Rosen, and her family. Ellen Rosen goes to synagogue, and the book really kind of gets us going with discussion of the fact that it's her New Year and the fact that people are going to be celebrating and gathering. And that's when people in her synagogue are tipped off that they actually need to escape, that they will no longer be safe. So we start the book really in a place where people are unfortunately starting to accommodate to this occupation, but also now there is a heightened awareness that things are changing. Right? Like that this occupation has been ongoing and that the country is not necessarily taking on a belligerent role, but is certainly not neutral.
Yeah, definitely. It is a really interesting, like, you're dropped into this family, like, and she does a really good job of placing you in this moment where it's clear that this isn't just starting. Like, I think the time period that she selects is really savvy, that she drops us in, several years into this occupation. And in fact, we find out that her older sister has been killed, we're initially told, in a car accident just 2 weeks before the sister was meant to get married to Peter, who is still kind of in their lives, as we'll find out in a significant way. But I thought that was really smart in terms of her storytelling to kind of drop us in. So it's like, this is a young girl whose only living memory in many ways is under Nazi occupation. For her younger sister, it's literally her only memory. And she's also like, this family is grieving like how their whole environment and city has changed, like the threats to these very good friends and neighbors, but also like they're grieving a sister. Like that's huge. And I thought that was really interesting. Like, I guess something that interests me about this book and the genre of which it's a part, which has its own history, which I'm sure we're going to get into in this and another episode, is sort of like, how do you write about something like the Holocaust for children? Like, where are the lines around that? Like, what kinds of violence are acceptable to show? What is perhaps gratuitous? And how do you know the difference? Like, if you make it too saccharine, then you're not showing the reality of what the Holocaust was. But then if it's too gratuitous or, like, how do you navigate that? So, I mean, before I even opened this up to reread it for tonight, I was just thinking, like, wow, what a challenge it must be to write a Holocaust, like a piece of fiction for young adults or children about the Holocaust.
So as you know, I'm always reading reviews of the things that we talk about, and I tend to excerpt them, and I'm always kind of curious. This is the first children's book of this kind that we've read, like gone back and reread for Patreon, where I found so many reviews by men. And I think possibly because it is a World War II book, or it is a book about the Holocaust, which might have a potentially larger appeal to a more general audience than other books that we've read, like Dear America, A Girl on the Titanic. So I'm reading through these different reviews, and this comment you made about, not making it too saccharine, that was actually a criticism that I saw, that this book was too simple or it was too sentimental. There is an underlying, I think, brilliant aspect of this narrative, which is that Anne-Marie is 10 and she has a younger sister, and she's very tied to her. And partially because of where they live in the world, they love fairy tales and they love these stories. And it's not blunt and it's not in your face, but where the narrative takes you is essentially very similar to Little Red Riding Hood, and a very basic story about a girl who has to journey into the woods and be brave. And in this case, there are Nazis that she has to confront with dogs that are very intense. It's a very frightening experience, but very much like wolves in the woods. And I didn't think it was too simple or saccharine at all. I felt like we were invested in her, but I also felt very wisely like there's this meta piece of this, which is she has been given stories that give her tools to think about bravery. And this story does the same thing.
I think that's 100% it. And I actually think the choice of fairy tales is not subtle in a way, because Bettelheim, who's a child psychologist, wrote a very famous book in which he explains how like fairy tales play this meaning-making role for children and or can or should play that role. So in other words, like there's a lot of work starting in the 1930s by cognitive psychologists that suggests that metaphor is not just a linguistic tool that's using one word when we mean another. It's like we literally think in metaphors. So to use fairy tales for children is a way to help them understand larger emotional things happening or to make meaning of the world around them. And as you can imagine, something as complicated as this, that would be important. So I thought it was yet another piece of excellent storytelling that she uses at different times. Little Red Riding Hood, but in the beginning of the story, the stories that she tells her younger sister falling asleep are about a king and a queen, and of course like a princess who has the sister's name, and so it plays this like practical role in the story of like allaying the fears of her sister, helping her fall asleep. But you can also see how this is a person who's sort of like straddling both childhood and adulthood, both reality and fiction, fairy tale and horror. And I think it's relatable. I think it's real. I think that's how people navigate traumatic situations.
Well, to your point about, books and stories, I think, a reference of our generation, The Fault in Our Stars, right? Which also connects to this in a variety of ways, which is a play on a line from Shakespeare. This title actually comes from Psalm 147:4, which is how all the stars in the sky are known and named and numbered by God. And part of why that title was chosen, which is it also connects to a necklace that Ellen, being a young girl, is given a necklace of a Star of David from her family. And it's very important to her. And it's something that she gives to her friend Anne-Marie to hold and to protect. And kind of to this point about metaphors, symbols, but the way that these things become real in our lives. That moment where she has to take off the Star of David because she's not safe in their community anymore and entrusts it to her friend. It shows you how much people of that age understand. And I think it gives young people credit, and it gives young people a capacity to say, like, you imbue things with meaning because they do have a lot of meaning.
Yeah, but I think it also, too, it shows how, like, bravery in times of war or trauma are often not these grand gestures, but small moments of real courage. So even in that scene, which to me was, like, haunting as an adult reading this book, they're told, like, he basically, the father Anne Marie's father says after dinner, you know, like they're anticipating going to the Rosens for their New Year party. And instead, Ellen is staying with them suddenly. And so the girls are kind of like, what's up? I mean, Christy's like in her own world, but Anne Marie's like, what's going on? And the dad's like, well, Ellen already knows, but now I'm going to tell you, you know, their synagogue was told that the Nazis were going to come and like relocate them. They still have no idea what that means. And so, you know, the parents have gone somewhere and Ellen is staying with us. And throughout this book, there's this theme of like need to know information.
Yes.
And so like that's all Anne Marie needs to know is like deemed like needing to know. And so basically he's like, she's going to be here. We're going to pretend she's your sister. And hopefully if the Nazis come, like they won't come during the night. If they don't find the Rosens at home, they won't knock on our door. Sure enough, they do. And it's like a terrifying scene. And in this moment, Anne Marie first sees her father have to, on the spot, pretend that Ellen is his daughter and the daughter that he's lost.
Yes.
And they don't believe him because she has dark hair and his other two daughters are blonde. And so he has to like in the moment improvise and like show the Nazi a photo of his dead daughter as a baby when she had dark hair. And the Nazi like tears that photo up and you're like, oh my God, that's like possibly his only baby photo of his now dead daughter. Like, oh my God. And while that's happening, Anne Marie's like watching her father be brave and like basically lying, but for a good purpose. Yes. And she has to like rip that Star of David necklace off of her friend's neck because they can't undo the hinge. And it's like harrowing. And you're like, oh my God, like these two quiet acts of bravery to save these dear friends. It's really stunning. And it's not like hitting you over the head, but it is like, you believe that like things like that actually did happen. And we know, of course, they did, you know, in these small acts of radical courage.
When you're young and you have that really good friend, it's like your fantasy that you're actually sisters, right? That it's like kind of playing that out. But these girls understand very quickly what the stakes are. To your earlier point about how much cruelty do you show, how much is appropriate, what is the line to gratuitous, where I think this book is so brilliant, especially for young people, is it shows the cruelty and the banality of so much of what they do. He does not need to tear up that picture. Mm-hmm. So there are places where this book could have had other kinds of violence against young people or adults. And instead, it's the terror that these people impose on the community. Mm-hmm. It's the fact that they're hanging out by a school for truly no reason and just bothering people because they can. And I think of the way that police and other forces terrorize certain communities, right? Their very presence is meant to be threatening. There are contexts in which the very fact that people are standing there, you think of the prevalence of things like stop and frisk, where it's like you existing is sufficient reason for me to treat you as if you've done something wrong. Mm-hmm. She doesn't have to overplay a hand of real violence that would have happened, which maybe would have made this book have less traction among a wide audience. They are so cruel, even when they encounter her in the woods and she says that she's bringing someone food. They rifle through it. They destroy most of what she's carrying. And she's a child. They don't have to do that.
Yeah, and it's sort of like, what's in it for you? Like on the baseline, if you're just like a foot level soldier in the Nazis, like what do you have to gain from taking, in this case, like baguettes from a young girl's basket that she's bringing to her uncle and throwing it literally to your dogs? Like, that's what they do. And, you know, in that moment, she's not only like terrified, I'm sure, for her own safety, but she's so terrified that, you know, her friend, the family, all these others who are hoping to escape aren't going to get there because she has this packet to deliver that may get intercepted. And this is where like the need to know information actually does protect her, because she's not told what's in the packet that she's trying to surreptitiously deliver, but she knows it's important. And so then when it's discovered and opened in its handkerchief, she's like genuinely surprised and can claim ignorance of it, which is kind of genius in terms of like how the resistance framed all of this, so that even as a child actor having to step up, you know, she's protected by the system that they've put in place. But she also has to perform a kind of innocence around it, which was kind of harrowing to read.
Yeah, we're kept out of the loop for much of the book, as she is, about the extent to which people in her life are a pretty significant part of the resistance effort. And I think the framing of her parents as kind of these intermediary people, right? Like they're friendly with the Rosens, but it's not really clear what their politics are right away. But you learn over the course of the book that her mother's brother, so her uncle, is actually making sure that people can cross over so that they can leave the country and they can go to literally a safe harbor. You learn that her sister and her then fiance were this big part of the resistance, and that's how they knew so much. Her father and her mother also become complicit in this kind of activity, and it's really not clear until I think the last chapter or two.
Yeah, and like you kind of go on this ride with her when they leave Copenhagen and go to her uncle's house, where I think she learns pretty early on that he's playing a role in helping people escape. But what's unclear to her is like the degree to which her mom is part of it initially. And so they have this like interesting evening, like mock funeral as a guise of explaining why so many people are gathered in one home. And the casket is closed and contains blankets that are meant to keep the Jewish people escaping warm on the boat in the hidden cabin of the boat. And so the Nazis come and they're like, what's going on here? And the mom immediately flies into her role as like basically an Academy Award winning actress because they're like, we know your customs, like it's open casket, so why aren't we seeing your great aunt, whoever? And she's like, well, she died of typhoid, so the doctor said we have to keep this closed. If you want us to open it and we can all risk getting typhoid, then like be our guest. And then the Nazi slaps her across the face. So the daughter has to like both see her mother be physically abused. Like this is the only violence we witness in the book, only physical violence. And also sees the mom lying flat out, but doing so with like such conviction and is so convincing. And when Anne Marie has this like interesting, again, mental moment where we see her train of thought where she says like, oh my God, he slapped my mom. And oh my God, my mom is pretending this thing is real that's not real. And I've been having to do that too. And in this moment, we're both equals. So it's like this moment of like they've both been infantilized, but the mother was just infantilized in some ways by the Nazis, and she's been like elevated to adulthood because of the seriousness of this situation. And she has the presence of mind to like actually stand outside of this moment and say like, wow, like we're both equals now.
What I think is kind of surprising looking at the roundedness of all of the characters is I don't think the Nazis come across as caricatures, which is kind of surprising. I think they come across, even though it's just kind of like successions of them, there are people who, like, for example, remember seeing Anne Marie and Ellen walk down the street. They have enough contact where they kind of have some baseline. And I think like their most defining characteristic is cruelty, but I think the author is wise to not make them just sort of cartoons of themselves, because you really do feel that fear and that question of like, okay, what is in this for you? Like, why are you so invested in this funeral? Why are you bothering people so much? But I also think that, the proof is it comes out eventually, according to the publisher. Over 7,000 people, almost the entire Jewish population of Denmark, was actually saved through their resistance and the acts of like the formal resistance network. So it's kind of appropriate. Like these people like really actually weren't effective in their methods. Like whatever they were trying to do, like the investigation of the picture, they somehow believed everything they were told. I don't know how she pulls that off, but I think it's different from other things I have read or watched where I felt like I didn't really understand those people as characters in the story.
I think that's true, because I think even something like The Sound of Music, if you want to go like big time pop culture reference, like Rolf like literally blows the whistle on the Von Trapps as they're trying to escape. And in some ways, like he is the only like humanized Nazi in the film. Like everyone else is sort of a caricature. But even Rolf, it's like really hard to tell what his motivations are, especially in light of his like relationship with Liesel or whichever one he was engaged to or perhaps engaged to. So yeah, you're right. Like, I think it's been very difficult to sort of like put a human face on the Nazis, which in many ways mirrors the history of like the post-war engagement with Nazis, which is like almost immediately after the war ends within Germany, there's like purposeful amnesia of like anyone supporting it. Like, oh no, that wasn't me. I didn't do that. And, you know, there's been a lot of interesting work on that about sort of like how people have erased their family histories, you know, and their support for the Nazis. So it, in some ways, popular culture has a hard time not making it a caricature because, you know, it's not as visible a history.
No, and I think, you know, it's not that I want to come out of a book like this feeling empathy for them, but I think when it's an opportunity that you understand something about that experience.
Yes.
And I think putting this from the point of view of a 10-year-old girl who's struggling to understand how her older sister, who she's missing, how her younger sister related to the world, how this is going to disrupt her friendships and her lives, watching her kind of figure out how her parents have to deal with these people. I'm trying not to draw a comparison that is too overwrought, but I honestly couldn't help but think of the way that a lot of parents in the United States have to have conversations with their children about how to interact with police that I never had to have.
Right. Yeah, me neither.
Just being honest, I never had that conversation with my parents. I think when you grow up in a white household as a female, it's sort of a joke that you'll cry. I have cried all 6 times because I'm nervous.
6? I didn't know if it was 6. Wow. Okay.
Okay, I drive a red car, so
yeah.
But I have always felt like I understood something about the stakes in those interactions as I've grown up, where it's like, I understand what a bad consequence in this situation is. I understand what a probable consequence is. And it's very different for me than it would be for a Black daughter talking to her parents.
Right. And honestly, like a lot of these conversations remind me of like the privilege that I grew up in on being on the other side of it, that honestly has actually distanced me generationally and ideologically from a lot of my relatives because, you know, as you can imagine, I grew up in an Irish family and there are a lot of police officers in my family more distantly. And I remember being a kid and being at like a distant relative's house who was a retired police officer and him like telling a story about how he would invoke laws that were technically on the books, but not actually enforced anymore, like lascivious carriage and stuff like that from the progressive era to stop and frisk basically anyone. And he was a police officer in an urban area. And most of the people he was stopping were, it was probably a means of profiling that he used in his day-to-day job. And it was like he was bragging about that and telling it as if it was a funny story. And I remember being a very young child and just being like, this doesn't feel good. It feels really wrong. And I felt deeply uncomfortable, but also like I wasn't allowed to say anything because of like where I was and the situation. And yeah, so I mean, yeah, like I don't think it's that overwrought a comparison because I think it's sort of like, it's still chilling to me now to think back to this person who is long dead, to think like, wow, like that was like a funny story for him to tell, that like not only was he not ashamed that he behaved that way and that he like invoked that privilege and enforced that kind of racialized violence, but he was bragging about it and he thought it was entertaining. It's terrifying. And it's like, that's terrifying to me now thinking about that. And even acknowledging that my privilege and how I've never had to face that myself, but just, you know, it's horrific. I do want to think though for a second about the erasure of Nazi kind of narratives, because I've read a book and it's over on my shelf. So I want to get the title right.
You look like you're in the kitchen.
Thank you. Yes. I have a virtual background going of it. I think this is from, I don't know what magazine this is from. Somebody sent this to me. And it's like interior designers who imagined what the Golden Girls kitchen would be like if they tried to recreate it now. So anyway, that's where I am tonight. Spiritually, that's where I live. But anyway, I just ran over to my bookshelf. So this is a book that I took out of the library originally, and then I immediately bought it because I wanted to own it. And it's called Belonging by Nora Krug, who is a graphic artist. And it's a memoir of her family history. Basically, she was once as a child on vacation in Italy with her dad. She's German, and her siblings and her mom. And they're in an Italian cemetery. She's not sure why. And the dad just sort of like takes off at one point on his own. And they catch up with him, and he's at a grave and he's crying. And she looks down, and the name on the grave is her dad's name. And she's like, Dad, this guy is your name. And he's like, yes, this is my brother. He died in World War II. He was a Nazi. He was killed in the war. And his parents had this guy, her dad, after the war, and gave him his dead brother's name. And so no one in her family would ever speak about the Nazi past that they had, but her dad had his basically brother's diary. So she read his diary, and basically it's about like a teenager falling in love with not fairy tales or folk tales, using that to explain his world, but the writings and the rhetoric of Hitler. So she has to like basically reckon with her own genealogy, which is not like something to brag about, but like trying to deal with like, what does it mean that all of my family is bound up in Nazism? And then prior to that, like real anti-Semitism that they profited from in Germany, from like taking Jewish businesses and, you know, like benefiting from the culture that elevated the Nazis. Like, what do you do with that when it's like 2019 and you're reckoning with this? And she now lives in the United States. So anyway, it's her drawings, but it's also like actual documents from her family history are in this book. And the writing is really beautiful and her thinking through that. But, you know, I think that that is something that would be interesting to thinking with this book too. Like, how do you tell a story about this with nuance? And I think she does it, but in the same but different way than Lois Lowry.
We have a lot of expats I know who are listeners, and some of them may even live in Europe, right, where they have children or they themselves have gone through the education system. I know that, you know, in America, obviously, we have all of these conversations right now about at the federal level mandating certain kinds of education about history. It is the case in Germany where certain kinds of education are both compulsory and other kinds of education are not allowed, right? Like there are manifestations of this in civic life and public history, so to speak, where certain people's death spots are not marked for fear that they will be made into a shrine for neo-Nazis. And then at the same time, people are compelled to learn certain things about their past. And honestly, I think of the many things happening in our country right now, that reckoning does not feel possible right now.
No, it definitely doesn't. I mean, even thinking about the fact that in a lot of prison systems, like the autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr., also Malcolm X's autobiography, are censored. They're restricted reading. You know, that's kind of hard to fathom when you think about the magnitude of what's going on in our country right now, that would be considered dangerous or, you know, need to be censored in the same way that Lois Lowry's books are still censored now. Like there are books that you can't assign or read in schools. It's interesting to think about the ways that we still think that certain books are a threat. And instead of like being required reading, which I think a lot of those books should be that I just named, they're in fact, you know, restricted. And we might think about why they're restricted in those spaces.
I also think this book coming out in 89 and then getting really, really big in 1990, again, almost like exactly the same Molly timeline. It wins the Newbery, which is huge, obviously, for children's literature, but I ended up doing some newspaper searches tightly around like 89 into 91. Like, what were people saying to Lois Lowry? Why did this book kind of get this huge traction that it did? And I think this book has something really interesting to say to us about neutrality, like thinking about this coming on the tail end of the Cold War, that it was never real, right? Like, so these are people who are situated in a country that is not not aligned, I should say, with one of the major two powers. And yet where they're situated and how they are occupied by the Nazis, there's no such thing as neutrality. They can't stand by. The family in question can't not be part of this, and the way that an entire resistance effort has to build up to get people to Sweden where they can be safe. I think that probably, you know, on a conscious level or not, thinking about what it means to even try to stay out of major world wars, how impossible it had been for so long.
Yeah, definitely. And Also thinking too about how this book coming out fits into then kind of like what's now its own genre of books for children about like set in the Holocaust and how those are situated. So this I see as like one type of Holocaust novel. So it's like a bystander, or like it's centered around characters who are helping Jewish people escape the Nazis. Then you have a genre of basically like fictionalized versions of the Diary of Anne Frank. So it's centered around Jewish people experiencing the Holocaust and, you know, like what happens to, say, a family, it's usually centered around a female protagonist. And I've read a lot of criticism that kind of like the book reviews you cited of this, where people are like, well, it's too saccharine because you don't show any death. Like the books would come up so far to like go, but like not reference a concentration camp, for example. And then you have books where it starts out in the present and then a girl like opens the door and suddenly is like back in Poland and she's like in the Holocaust and goes to a concentration camp. And I sent you a Wikipedia page to a book that Anna read that I have not read. But Anna has like visceral memories of reading this book where a girl like goes back in time and goes through the Holocaust and ends up like in a gas chamber and gets killed and then like wakes up back in New York in the 80s or something. It's like, it's not okay. I'll say that. But that's a style of those books too. Like that's not the only one. And I've read reviews of like not just that book, but some others. I'm trying to remember the name of the author who wrote like one of the first ones in that style of like the flashback. And people were like, no, like that's actually how the book should be, because then young people can relate to the beginning of the book. And once they like relate to the character, and like this review references like the character references watching like General Hospital, so kids like know like they can relate. And then it's like she's, you know, in the Holocaust. It's like, to me, that's where it kind of jumps to a place where I'm like, I don't know if this is what should be happening here.
So Lois Lowry gets kind of treated, as you're saying, because she is writing a book about the Holocaust, but the protagonist is not a Jewish girl, right? So she is again kind of taking on this savior role. She plays this important thing. And I found a lot of articles very similar to this one from the Miami Herald in the summer of 1990. And they're basically talking about like, wow, like children's books have exploded. Like no one could have ever guessed that like this industry would be like, basically part of what they're talking to her about is like, we can't print your books fast enough. And there's a portion of this article where she compares winning the Newbery to being, quote, like an Oscar, not accompanied by a check, but it has a residual tangential effect of ensuring pretty good sales. But there's a part of this where I think she hits on something that I think is really spot on, which is talking about the effect of baby boomers who want to buy certain kinds of books. And over the course of the interview, the journalist says, and the yuppies and their desire to do the best for their kids, part of which is buying these books. And they talk about how like these quote unquote yuppies and these boomers who want their children and grandchildren to understand something about the world are looking for a more diverse range of stories. And one of the other lines in this article says, things have come a long, long way from Make Way for Ducklings and The Little Engine That Could.
Wow.
Which I think is a simplification of children's literature.
I was going to say, that seems like a very weird comparison, because like even reading level is completely, like they're for completely different age groups. And yeah, I mean, but also it's like, actually that's an interesting comparison, because The Little Engine That Could comes from Mind Cure thinkers. I think I can is like absolutely Mind Cure in a saying. And those, for people for whom that way of thinking was important, thought if you change your way of thinking, you can change your circumstances, you can change your life. And one Holocaust memoir, Man's Search for Meaning, is often cited as like one of the most inspirational books. And it's used in a lot of therapeutic situations to inspire people. And this is like, I don't know why this has always stayed in my mind, because I think I just found like the juxtaposition to be strange. But sometimes the situations where I've read where it's prescribed, so to speak, are somewhat like this is not remotely like what the author is talking about. So Jimmy Fallon at one point, like, remember when he hurt his finger?
Yes.
Okay, so like when that was happening, my mom was like closely monitoring this for reasons I can't fully understand. I wasn't watching his show at the time, but like every day my mom was like, the finger's still in a cast. Like he's not doing well. His mental health has been bad. And at one point she was like, he said when he was in the hospital, like somebody gave him this search, Man's Search for Meaning, gave him this book and like he read it and it really helped him like mentally get through the experience of having like broken his finger or something. But it was like, okay, but that's how people are reading. That tells a story itself about how people imagine the uses for not only Holocaust memoirs, but presumably too, like these YA books.
And what you're saying about asking people to really invite themselves into the narrative or to try to put themselves there,
right,
and the different ways that that's done. I found a ton of articles where children were asked to make, after reading this book, asked to make some kind of visual representation about the number of real children who died in the Holocaust or some visual. What's really telling is in a lot of the mainstream articles I found about Number of the Stars, this book is really touted, sometimes Anne Frank, as like what children should read. And then I found the Wisconsin Jewish Chronicle. I can imagine this playing out in other newspapers that are designed for people looking for certain kinds of books about the Jewish experience. And they point out that it's become easier by the 1990s to find books about Jewish children in any time period in a more mainstream way. But they really emphasize in this interview, every Jewish child needs role models to identify with. They need to see other Jewish children in contemporary settings and situations. And the section in this article, there's like one section about like, this is an important history to pass on, but a much greater emphasis on like, show, this is not surprising, but like show people living, right? Like show, resilience across the centuries. I think, similar to other criticisms where it's like, why does the one representation have to be trauma? And to their credit, Rebecca Rubin takes place in a different time period in the AG universe.
It kind of resonates with me too about like this being Black History Month and a lot of the public history or public humanities kind of virtual things that people are being invited to take part in. In the past, I've been hesitant to kind of organize some of these national movements at my work because a lot of them are like, come transcribe like slavery records, and a lot of students of color and just like the general public, like asking people to appreciate a culture through just purely trauma history or trauma bonding is not appropriate or not what people want in terms of celebrating their culture. And in fact, this year, and it's a kind of a cool transition, I'm seeing like a real trend towards Afrofuturism, which is really cool. And so thinking about the ways that like how we engage the past and how we like frame interpretation and celebration, I think are really interesting across a lot of these kind of topics. But it does make me wonder, like, what do you make of the fact that we've lived through, like, not to do any kind of like trigger your trauma of the time that I forced you to come see The Fault in Our Stars with me without telling you what the story was about ahead of time. But like that scene has a prominent scene in which people make out in the Anne Frank house. And there was some other example where like, oh yeah, Justin Bieber going to the Anne Frank house and like being what he thought was appropriate, which I'm actually willing to defend was sort of a true statement, which is like, if Anne Frank was alive today, she'd be a believer. Like, I actually think that's true. That's what he wrote in the guest book. And like, from the lips of Eves in this case, like, I actually think that's a true statement. But what do we make of like her house as a space in pop culture? And what does it tell us, I guess, about how we're thinking with the Holocaust in pop culture today?
I mean, I can't speak, about that, like, too intelligently beyond experiences I've had, which is, I've been in my journeys through Poland and Germany. I've been to places, right, that are really important and horrifying sites of this story. And what I've seen on film, like, didn't represent my experience at all, to be honest with you. And I've told people, like, there's, so part of what I do is like, I do interpretation. I take people through experiences, and I've heard people say, and if you're doing your job right, everyone is still talking on the way out, and there's a lot of conversation. And I totally disagree with that. I went to a resistance house when I was in when I was traveling as part of that trip, and that and other experiences, I didn't talk for a really long time after that because it was very affecting to me to see an actual physical tight space where people had hidden, and it really was, it moved me. It was a really impactful experience to actually stand in the space, and it was like people hid here. This was a real experience, and it was completely different from seeing Schindler's List because it put me in the spot of like being a claustrophobic person and saying like, this is where this happened, right? Like, this isn't a set. This is where this happened. And to also, I think part of what's different about that experience is in some places you're walking down the same cobblestones they walked down. Like, it's literally the same sidewalk. And I think that's very affecting. And I think the Holocaust was like everywhere in our childhood and also not handled well. Like, I think this book is actually a very good example of, we start with this girl who says like, I don't want to be brave. I think that's very real. I think that's a very real representation of what it means to be a person.
Yeah, and I think, too, something that wasn't handled well that kind of resonates with me listening to you describe your experiences. When you were speaking, I was thinking of that line, not to be trite, that like Walt Whitman is famous of saying of the Civil War, which is like the real war we'll never get in the books. Like, some things are beyond language. And it kind of sounds like that was your experience. And so if the reality of the past is never going to make it into even a Holocaust memoir, never mind a YA book, then what is the point of these books? And it seems like the point should be to make the history actionable for the present. And I think something that was missing in the 90s when we were kids, and still now in a lot of ways, is building that bridge from the Holocaust to now. Like, not seeing the Holocaust as a finished historical event. Like, anti-Semitism existed. It was horrible. The Nazis were targeting Jewish people. This massive genocide happened. But that ended in 1945. Like, we've never had a similar situation since. It's like, that actually never ended. Like, anti-Semitism, like, the clock is still running. In many ways, it's getting worse, just even in the past few years in our country. And not just anti-Semitism, like all forms of racism, like this kind of huge hatred that seems to be going unchecked. Like, that seems to be the space where we need to be drawing connections between history and now, and saying it's not the same, like the past is not the present, but there are these ties, there are these lessons that we need to learn.
I also think it's very easy to be critical of these kinds of books, and when they're not done well, to say they're too pat. But part of what inspired this book was Lois Lowry's conversations with a childhood friend to whom the book is dedicated, who lived through some very real trauma. And Lois Lowry writes in an afterword about the extent to which she did research about real young people who were part of the resistance. And I think what this book shows you is the many shades of gray. I took one of my first college classes. We were reading Solzhenitsyn, and we were looking at different literatures of the 20th century, gulags and genocide. And I think part of why that's important to do is it gets you past these conversations of like, well, these people are bad actors, or this is something that has bad apples, and then here are good people. You know, there are people who are put in impossible situations and they make a range of decisions, and how and why do people do that? And I think one of the representations that I think I learned the most of the Holocaust is the reader. Because at the core of that film is a story about a woman who both had a lot of power and kept a secret that belies how much power she could have actually understood, right? Or like, you know, how much she actually understood about what was happening. But she still was an instrument of very cruel things. And it makes you really think about that. And then you also see her as a woman who has relationships, right? And I think that's a more effective way to get people to think. You know, like us doing this, it's like we're drawing out comparisons as we see them. I can imagine other people reading this book and seeing completely different things because they've experienced anti-Semitism.
Right. Like, I can imagine if I was a person of Jewish descent reading this book, like, it might be actually really troubling to think, why is the only Holocaust narrative that I'm seeing in, like, this era of book centering the experience of non-Jewish actors who become the air quotes hero of the narrative, right? Like, even her friend is not the center of the story. Like, Anne Marie
Right.
is the center of the story. And it's really a story about her family. And maybe Lois Lowry, like, that's as far as she was willing to go. Like, she didn't want to step into the shoes of, like, to embody, like, a Jewish experience that she doesn't herself have. You know, there could be a litany of things going on there. We don't know. But yeah, as you're saying, I can imagine tons of responses, different responses to this book.
I think it's also of a trend that has continued, which is when I learned about slavery, I think I learned just as much, if not more, immediately about the Underground Railroad.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like that to have been a reflection of a world in which people were learning, how to be good upstanders and how to be courageous. But all of those stories centered good white people.
Right.
And I think part of what's valuable about this book is you do actually see Ellen and the Rosens really as agents in the resistance. You see Jewish people actively taking part in the resistance for their own survival and for the survival of people in their community. And you learn that the rabbi who runs their synagogue, like, he's taking a huge risk by telling them to leave. And I think that's important because I do recall, or I do kind of have this memory from my childhood of, like, being taught that these liberation efforts were, like, led by helpful white people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I didn't just make that up. I got that from somewhere. And I think that's a very unhelpful way to also go through the world, because you don't actually learn very much about how these things worked.
Yeah, and I think something that's another asset of this book is that it's really about a community story. Like,
Yes.
I can't think of one hero in this book because everyone is playing a really important role. Like, everyone in this moment has a moment when they do something that's really significant. And if they didn't do this, like, small act of courage, the whole thing would have come, tumbling apart. So I think it's really modeling mutual aid in a really beautiful way. And I think that's also in different comparison to a lot of the ways that, histories or stories are still told, where it's like, well, there was this one really important person. Like, we just had President's Day. So much of American history is about, like, this president was really significant, like this one person. And of course, like, that is not how history works. And I think, like, decentering a central figure and making it more about the community, I think would be really instructive and helpful in a whole host of ways.
Well, Lowry says that she really was inspired by this research that she was able to do. And the girl on the cover is a real 10-year-old that she actually encountered while she was doing this research, which I never knew before.
I didn't know that either.
But she cites a letter in her afterword, which was actually from a resistance fighter who died, much like the fictional sister in this book. And it reminded me a lot of what you see circulating lately about people saying, like, well, we just have to go back to the way things were before the pandemic, as if that was good. And there's an excerpt from this letter that he leaves behind to his family where he says, "You must not dream yourselves back to the times before the war, but the dream for you all, young and old, must be to create an ideal of human decency and not a narrow-minded and prejudiced one." I think that really speaks to when people are saying, like, no, we can't go back to normal. Like, normal was quite bad.
Not great. Yeah, not good. Well, even, like, thinking about the awful situation that people in Texas and nearby areas are facing this week with the terrible weather that they've experienced and the infrastructure issues that have made it exponentially more awful for folks there. Like, hearing people talk on the news as if, like, Texas is its own country, like their problems have nothing to do with us. If that's actually how you think about things, then you should not be pursuing the United States as a national project of which you also want to be a part. Like, if you can't understand mutual aid independence, we shouldn't be pursuing, like, or romanticizing this imagined national history that you're using to defend your current views on God knows what. Like, if you don't invest in community aid and mutual aid after this whole pandemic experience, like, I can't help you. That's all I can say.
Well, I think to your point, this is a story about how people fit into each other's lives and how they work to ensure each other's survival. I think opening with a scene where everyone is threatened by the presence, right, of these people in the community and the way that they all understand on some level, but also the sharpness with which they notice changes, right? Like when business owners go out of business, everyone takes note that these are people who are now fleeing for a reason. That's a very different, I mean, how accurate that is. Maybe it is a rosy tint on certain things, but I think the lesson is good.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And we're going to be talking about this a lot more. We're so lucky. We have an expert who is going to come on and talk to us and tell us a little bit more about archival and translation work that she's doing around stories of women and girls' resistance during the war. But I think we're not evaluating if it like held up, but you can understand why this book was as successful as it was.
Yeah. I think the writing is so sharp, and I like the imagined world that she brings you into. And I think, like I said, having like us be able to walk through the story with Anne Marie, but also kind of be in her head at crucial moments as you can see her navigating like what performance of girlhood to show to the Nazis or to her parents or to her friend. It's just so nuanced. It like still even reading it as an adult, I was very moved by it.
Yeah. And I mean, the book is interesting because it has an ending, but it doesn't really have resolution. Mm-hmm. You don't really know, right? Because Anne Marie holds on to her friend's Star of David necklace, and she says that she plans to hold it for as long as she needs to. You don't know what happens.
You don't. Yeah. And you know, that's interesting to end without a full resolution is interesting. And in fact, I think a better ending than had she resolved it per se.
Yeah, I think if this book came out now, it would be like 10 years later and they'd be having lunch.
Yeah.
You know, they'd be like stenographers somewhere having lunch.
Christy would be like, remember when I had to wear fish scale shoes?
They'd be like, we don't need it.
Out. Yeah, we don't need to hear about that today. Good times. Christy actually like was a favorite character of mine. I love like an extra little sister character. Yeah. She was great. She added like some nice levity to the moment, but also like terror because there was a couple crucial scenes where we were like, please don't speak right now because you're going to give away like crucial information we don't need these soldiers to know.
No, and the way that, you know, children of almost every age are incorporated into the story, there is a whole conversation about a baby who is going to be making this passage. And the fact that the baby essentially, according to the resistance fighters, needs to be drugged. Mm-hmm. And the parents' very real concern over this fact that this baby is going to be drugged for hours. There's this like amazing moment of awareness by Anne Marie where she's learned a fact, which is that her friend Ellen's mother is afraid of the ocean. And then she learns a second fact, which is that she's going to be put in a boat and hidden on the way to Sweden. And she has this moment where she's like, well, she's going to be so afraid. Mm-hmm. And it's so beautifully woven in where like it's written so a 10-year-old can get it, but you think like that's very relatable.
It is. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. This was a nice reread. It was a good experience.
I do have to say, so reviewer Adam, he says, is it just me or do most books about girls during World War II suck? Thank God there's the History Channel. And I'm just here to say, Adam, like, wow. I just think maybe this book wasn't the space for you.
You know what? You didn't deserve this book, Adam. I don't know you, but you probably deserve the History Channel, and I'll leave it at that.
Yes, I agree.
Well, I'll go write a better review. Like, I need to even out Adam's like contribution, whatever website you found that on. And
Gary called it wonderful, so I don't mean to.
Thank you, Gary.
Not all reviewers.
Gary, ally Gary. Wow. All right. Well, this even makes me even more excited for our next conversation about kind of like resistance writing or resistance archives that we have of women during the war. And we really want to hear from you. Like, what are your Lois Lowry memories? And,
yes.
Related, did you like Jacob Have I Loved? And do you want to talk about it? If so, please reach out to me on Instagram at Mimi Mahoney or Twitter at Mary Mahoney123. And, if you want to tell Allison that she's wrong about certain opinions about A Tree Grows in Brooklyn or, Jacob Have I Loved or kind of whatever. Also said with love because we're allowed to like and dislike whatever we want. I can respect that. Allison, where can people find you?
I'll just say I'm very open to a reread. I
Okay.
can be found at Allison Horrocks on both of those things. You can, of course, follow the show. And we love when you comment on our posts on Patreon. That really helps us,
Yes.
honestly, pick future directions. And when you send us messages there, it really it rises to the top. And so we're able to see, okay, this is what people like, this is what they want. And it's very helpful for us when you do that.
Excellent. So we had so much fun with our last watch along. We're definitely going to be doing more of those in the future. So as Allison said, if there's things you want to watch together, please message us or post about it. If you want to suggest future books or movies for us to talk about on Patreon episodes, please do the same. We do so appreciate you supporting the Patreon and the show. We really love this community. And again, if you want any future Discord channels for us to create, we just added a genealogy channel, which is already hopping. It's really cool. Just let us know. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.